All right. Well, happy Friday and welcome to today's program. We are so grateful to everyone joining us live for our Lunch and Learn Every Vote Equal, the national popular vote. And thank you to everybody who is watching this recording on YouTube. The National Popular Vote Compact is a proposal to ensure a fundamental democratic principle that the presidential candidate who receives the most votes is the one who becomes president. This year, the Maine Legislature is considering a bill to join the 17 states that have already enacted the National Popular Vote Compact. Together, those 17 states have 205 or represent 205 of the 270 electoral votes needed to trigger the compact and elect the president by popular vote. If you have some questions about what all of that means, you are in luck because we have two wonderful and brilliant speakers with us today to make it all make sense. Will Hayward is the Advocacy Program Director with the League of Women Voters in Maine and a good friend of MCV's. Will, thanks for being with us today. Chris Pearson is the Executive Director of National Popular Vote and a former Vermont State Representative and State Senator. He was a climate champ in the Vermont Legislature and is a terrific person to have with us today to walk us through the National Popular Vote Compact. Thank you both for being with us.
Look forward to
My
it.
name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate, and MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us achieve all of those goals or advance them. We're almost there. Got a little bit more work to do. Creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, our policy priorities, the climate action movement, and more. Just a few details before we dive in. We'll hear from our speakers first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send questions to me or to Maggie Summers through the chat whenever they occur to you. We'll synthesize them and ask as many of them as possible following the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, Maggie can help you out. Just send her a message through the chat. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You will also receive the recording in a follow-up email, and you can find recordings of all of our previous programs on YouTube, where there are a bunch of different playlists to help you focus in on particular topics. I think that's it for logistics. Thank you all for joining us. And Will and Chris, I will turn it over to you to kick us off.
Hey, well, thank you so much for having us today. We're so excited to get to speak with you about the National Popular Vote, share a bit of how it works, some of the problems it helps overcome, and how we can help make it a reality. So Chris, if you can get the slides up, then we will go ahead and we will dive right in with an introduction to the National Popular Vote. So what are we going to cover today? I will start us off with just a little bit of how does the National Popular Vote work, sort of what are we talking about, and then we'll go into what are the problems with the current system, why is it so important that we have a National Popular Vote, what are the benefits of a popular vote for the presidency, what are some of the myths around the National Popular Vote and why are they myths? Where is it in Maine currently? Where is the National Popular Vote? And then finally, how can we take action on national popular vote? So I want to start us off today just with a very quick review of how does the United States elect our president. So under the Electoral College, each state is given a number of electors that roughly corresponds with its population. These electors then cast their electoral votes for president, and if a candidate gets 270 or more electoral votes, that is a majority of the Electoral College, they are elected president. So how are these electoral votes determined? And the way that this is determined under the US Constitution is very general. And I will just read it because it's so simple. Each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. And so the key point I want to draw folks to here is this language, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct. And what this means simply is that each state's legislature is empowered to say how its electoral votes are cast for the presidency. And so the national popular vote is a way to do that. The national popular vote is an agreement between states that will guarantee the presidency to the candidate who gets the most votes, the most popular votes in all 50 states and DC. Each state that joins this compact, they agree that we will cast our electoral votes, all of our electoral votes, to the candidate who gets the most votes, the most popular votes across the whole country. So they agree that they will all cast their electoral votes for that candidate. And so crucially, this agreement goes into effect when states that equal that majority of the Electoral College have signed on. So when states that equal 270 electoral votes or more have joined the National Popular Vote Agreement, they say, okay, now we will cast all of our electoral votes for the candidate who got the most popular votes for president across the country, and this guarantees that that candidate is the one who will be elected president. So the national popular vote, just to check in on the status of it right now, we're already up to 16 states in DC, including 4 small states, and we'll talk a bit more about small states later because that's an interesting point to note. We are over 205 we're at 205 electoral votes, so over 200. Minnesota just joined and helped hit that exciting milestone last year. We have 65 electoral votes to go to reach 270, and so we really are really excited about Maine being the next state that we can get to help get us towards 270. The national popular vote, just broadly as a proposal, it is nonpartisan. We actually have bipartisan co-sponsors in Maine, which is really great. The proposal favors voters. It doesn't favor parties, land, geography, factions, or states. And I think I lost the screen there for a second.
What happened? Bear with me, sorry.
No worries, technical difficulties happen.
Sorry, Will, you were on a roll there. There we go.
I'll pick it back up on that one. So the national popular vote, it favors voters. It doesn't favor parties, land, geography, factions, or states. And finally, the national popular vote is constitutional. It doesn't change the Constitution, and it doesn't abolish the Electoral College. It simply works through that method I described a couple of slides ago, where each state is saying, this is how we are going to allocate our electors. And why is it so important that we move to a national popular vote? Why is this system so much better than the current system? I will pass it over to Chris to describe why.
Thanks, Will. And forgive me, I'm trying to run the slides for us and be entertaining. So the problem there are many problems in the way we elect the president today, and they really do stem from the state use of winner take all, or in Maine, the district system is maybe marginally better, but that creates a lot of problems. And in shorthand, if you're walking down Main Street, people would say, well, there are problems with the Electoral College. But we have dug in a little deeper and found that actually The problem is in the way the Electoral College is working today, not necessarily in the fact that the state has this power over the Electoral College as a system. And of course, the solution is right there in the same way we've arrived at the problem, which is changing the state laws that winner-take-all laws that exist. Maine took that step in 1969, in effect for the 1972 election to create the district system. The winner-take-all system creates the dynamic where, number one, and this is the sort of headline, we elect the second place candidate. We're unique in the world. This is a real stain on the principles of democracy. We can elect the second place candidate. That's happened twice in our lifetimes, but 5 times overall. And of course, we've only had 46 presidents. So that's a pretty significant error rate. We wouldn't accept that in most modern, you wouldn't get on a plane in Boston if it 5 out of 46 times was not going to bring you to Houston, but instead dump you in Seattle, right? That this is an unacceptable error rate. And really erodes faith in some of the central premises that we're engaged in, like telling people their vote counts, and insisting that you got to get out there, this really matters. And people sort of say, well, last time, we gave the most votes to somebody and then they didn't take the office. What are you talking about? Another problem that comes more persistently than five times in our history, where we've elected the second place candidate, this happens every time. Because of winner take all, we have a system that puts a few Americans in a very special place of having an outsized ability to influence the outcome of the election. And most of us, 70% of American voters at least, in a place where we live in a safe jurisdiction, where we're effectively taken for granted. That's because we live in a safe red or a safe blue state, and the candidates don't visit us, they don't poll us, there's no grassroots activity, there's no ads, there's no courting of our votes, there's no asking us about issues that matter to us. That's because most of us live in a safe red or safe blue state. So we have some data here quickly that highlights this. This is looking at campaign events in the general election. So September and October, this is in the 2012 election. 100% of the money and the events in the general election 2012 went to this small fraction of states here. And you can see Ohio, 73. That was about a quarter of the whole campaign took place in Ohio in 2012. A very similar dynamic in 2016, although you see a bunch of states with 1 visit or 2 or 3 visits. This was a factor of the fact that Trump was running, did win, of course, running and spraying around the country a little bit. I think his advisors finally said, hey, there's only 12 states that matter here that will determine the outcome. 2020 was a little more standard. Again, just a very, very small fraction of the American voter playing a decisive role. In 2024, the Washington Post did an analysis, found 18% of American voters will be in a position to cast a meaningful vote, in sense of decisive vote. And that's because we already know it's coming down basically to Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. This is deeply, deeply damaging. And since we're talking to climate groups, I'll just say, this is one of the reasons that the Sierra Club and the conservation voters have signed on and endorsed this nationally. They've noticed over time that climate issues haven't really been generally part of the campaign discussion by virtue of the fluke of which states are in play and whether or not, Arizona and Ohio wish to talk about climate issues. There's a flip side to that. If you live in the battleground states, there's an advantage to you. You get more federal grants. You get a ton of campaign activity, which itself is economic development. But you also get things like more No Child Left Behind waivers, more disaster declarations with more money. You're sitting in the White House. You know which states got you there, and you know which states will either reelect you or keep your party in power. And so we shouldn't be surprised under that system that that those voters continue to be courted. And then this one takes a minute, but bear with me. When we have a system that depends on the outcome in just a small number of battleground states, we know that some of those states, again, there's nothing special about a battleground state other than they're a 50-50 state. They could go either way. And in this time of narrow political division, tight political division, we cannot be surprised that, in fact, some of the battleground state outcomes are very, very close, right? We watched Joe Biden in 2020 was a great example. Joe Biden, in fact, won by 7 million votes. We weren't sure for many days whether or not he was going to win in the Electoral College. And it wasn't until Arizona, Wisconsin, and Georgia, those 3 states were called, and they all went for Biden narrowly, and that we understood the will of the people was also reflected in the outcome of the Electoral College. You don't take a 7 million vote margin to court credibly. You can, and they did take an 11,000 vote margin in Georgia, similar margin in Wisconsin to court. There were some 60 lawsuits filed in 2020. All of a sudden, charges of irregularities, of voter fraud, of absentee ballot fraud, on and on and on, catch fire. And that narrative, of course, still holds today for far too many Americans. That then led to what we saw on January 6th. The protests on January 6th happened to try to interrupt the counting of the electoral votes. You saw in Congress objections to 3 states, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, to those results. They were the 3 tightest election results, a total margin of about 43,000 votes and change, even though the nation was a 7 million vote margin, right? So as long as we have a narrow, a sort of tight divide in our country, and as long as we are dependent on outcomes in any particular state, we can't be surprised that this creates a great deal of instability, lawsuits. Suddenly the people are sidelined and we're waiting to see if judges and lawyers uphold a very clear choice of the people. And in a horrifying part of our history, of course, it did result in or led directly to a storming of the Capitol. Again, because we were all watching just a few states and to see what their outcome was, when there was no particular discrepancy or question in the national outcome. The other thing that this creates, this is the famous red-blue map we watch every 4 years, and either high five your partner or cry in your beer, I guess, depending on how it comes out. This is red and blue. You might say it's black and white, right? Texas would seem to be all red. And in fact, I think this fails a nuance of our country. Are we a red and blue nation? If you're a Democrat in Oklahoma, if you're a Republican in California, do you have any friends at all? Anyone that shares your values? In fact, this is distorted by population, but we're a purple nation, right? I mean, going back to Maine, Maine seems blue. Of course, the second CD went to Trump, so he got a quarter of the votes, but he earned 42% of the vote in the state. So this red-blue map and the system we use today exaggerates our sense of being divided and kind of alienates far too many people, all the while disenfranchising a great bulk of the American voter. So really, at a time when we're watching faith in our systems be eroded, when we're seeing deep cynicism in the system, in our government, in the presidency itself, setting aside the characters, the polling numbers are stark if you're watching how Americans view our entire operation here. I think it comes back in many, many ways to the way we elect the president and that feeling or lack of ownership that far too many Americans have over the highest profile, the biggest election in our country. But it's a positive. Well, let's turn it up a beat here and hand it back to Will to tell you some good things.
So I'm back to give the good news, which is what the national popular vote can help turn us towards. So as we heard the national popular vote will move us from this system where we have this narrow set of battleground states where so many votes across the country won't matter, so many people won't be campaigned to, and it moves to a system that achieves these three core things. It moves to a system where every vote in every state, in every presidential election, will be equal and relevant. It moves to a system where the candidate with the most votes across all 50 states and DC is the one who is elected president. And it ensures that candidates will be motivated to seek voter support in all 50 states. So it's a transformative change in what our presidential campaigns, what our presidential elections, and as we saw, what our governance would look like if we move to a national popular vote. There's some other great benefits that election by popular vote for the presidency would result in. This first one, I work for the League of Women Voters of Maine, and we get so excited about voter turnout. We're so proud of when, Maine does well at this, and we're always looking at how we can do more. I think a national popular vote would be one of the single biggest things we could do to improve turnout in Maine. We see that voter turnout in battleground states is higher than in non-battleground states, and it's very easy to see why. If I think my vote is going to matter in a presidential election, if I think I have some role in determining the presidency, I'm going to be more likely to vote. And when you think about how many states are not battleground states and the opportunity to raise voter turnout in all of those states, it's a really transformative, exciting thing. And another thing that Chris spoke to briefly is that sense of ownership for voters everywhere. If I think my vote matters, then I feel this sense of, that I am holding my government accountable to my vote. My government has to respond to me because I will vote and my vote will matter. And so my voice matters. And so I have a sense of ownership over the governance process. This point that we made about candidates seeking support across all 50 states, well, this really excites me. And I think this point about being able to, build the grassroots is really exciting. I work in Maine. Chris is based in Vermont, and I'm sure we both know people who have been, excited about the presidential campaigns, have said, I want to, go out in my community. I want to encourage people to support my presidential candidate. And then they go to their local party office and they say, hey, go to New Hampshire, go do it there. And that's not what people want to do. They want to be, helping their candidate win, but they want to do that by building a community of powerful, engaged people in their community. And when you have a popular vote where every vote is equal, that's really possible. It can really build that grassroots civic strength, and that's really exciting to me. And then finally, I think this point about confidence and faith in the process is so, so important. Like, it's staggering the narrow margins that come up when we're just dealing with a few states, the sort of litigating over these very specific minor details, when with a popular vote we can look and we can say very simply, this candidate got the most votes for president across the whole country. That sort of mandate of a candidate having received the most votes being the one who is president, and that being something that can happen without question, it will really go a long way into building, strength in our institutions, strength in both our elections, and strength in faith in our presidency, which are so important in these tough times. So I want to turn it back to Chris to discuss a bit of the myths that we hear about national popular vote. I alluded to this first one about small states earlier, so I will give it to you to start with that, and then we can just run through a few others.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I work all across the country on this bill. I've probably been involved in about a dozen of the 17 states that have enacted national popular vote, and we hear a very, very routine, similar set of questions just about everywhere you go. I remember in Albany working hard there and having legislators say to me, well, what about the small states? And I sort of looked at him and I thought, what part of Syracuse has any small state? And by that time, Vermont, where I was serving in the House at the time, had passed this. And the rather condescending answer I got, but this comes up a lot, and this is probably the most straightforward myth, because many of us were basically taught that the Electoral College exists to protect small states. We've sort of overlooked, of course, the deeply unsettling history of our original sin, where the 3/5 compromise and empowering the southern states had much more to do with the setup of the Electoral College. But nevertheless, you do run into this a lot. And small states like Maine and Vermont do have a mathematical advantage in the Electoral College the way it works today, but we have no particular political advantage. And that goes back to the way that states have power today is by being a battleground state. And most of the small states are not toss-ups at all, other than New Hampshire, which has routinely been, and I'm talking in the fall election, they get their plum assignment in the primaries, but also in the fall election, they have generally been a battleground state. They've had, as this slide indicates, since the last 4 elections, they had over 50 visits in the fall. DC had one that was probably a sitting president who happened to be there, or in 2008. So that might have been Obama or McCain doing a local event, a day off in the Senate. And then Maine, in fact, in your second CD, has had over those 4 elections a total of 7 visits from either the candidate or the vice presidential candidate. So in fact, Maine has had about what you might expect when we have a popular vote, where every vote's equal. But you have no particular advantage. In the meantime, in the current setup, and in the meantime, of course, all of the other small states have no advantage because we're safe red or safe blue states. And in fact, when we passed this bill in Vermont, somebody brought this up on the House floor, and the sponsor of the bill stood up and said, we have just as much power as New York, 0. And as we passed this bill in Albany, one of the things that finally made the difference was we printed a flyer that said the candidates spent $34 million courting 4 electoral votes in New Hampshire, and they spent at the time a weird number, $1,400 in New York. And this did get the attention of the gentleman from Syracuse and elsewhere. And then the history is there too to back this up. Senator Chase Smith was a sponsor of an amendment to undo the Electoral College in 1960, joined by several sponsors from other small states. And the proof is in the pudding, in that 5 states, if you count DC as a state, have already passed national popular vote. And in fact, there's a great speech from Senator Dole, who said on the Senate floor in support of a direct election of the president, said, I used to think that we benefited from as a small state, but when I really dug into it, what I found was the people that benefit are the people in battleground states. And if it protects the small states, if there's a benefit to the small states today, then you'd have to look at the big states and see, well, what happens there? Of course, our 4 biggest states, California, Texas, Florida, and New York. Now that Florida is basically tipped into a safe red state, they have no particular influence. That's outrageous, right? There's millions and millions of Americans live in those 4 biggest states, and they are just as sidelined and taken for granted as we are in Vermont, as you are by and large in Maine and elsewhere, not as they are in New Hampshire. Our good friends in between our states do very well and have a lot of influence. So sometimes we just have to dig in a little bit to these myths. The a similar related myth is people say, well, if we have a popular vote, campaigns will just go to all the big cities and people in rural parts of the country will be ignored. There's only about 10 cities with more than 1 million Americans. So actually our cities are smaller than people think. And as you see here, there's the 100 biggest cities, and this gets down to like Bellingham, Washington, I think is the 100th biggest city of about 300,000 people. It has about 59 million people, 60 million people, and rural America has about almost exactly the same total. And so there's about 19% of the population live in the big cities, and 19% of the population live in rural America. And when every vote's equal, A vote is a vote is a vote. There's no reason that you'd go court the city voters and ignore the rural voters. And we can see this in lots of examples. Nobody wins the governor's race by campaigning exclusively in Portland and Bangor, right? Shame on you if you did that. It wouldn't work, and you would be rightly chided. You see in presidential elections, when Trump won Pennsylvania in 2016, he did not win Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. By the way, half the population of Pennsylvania live in those two cities. He didn't win the big cities, and he won Pennsylvania decisively because he did very strongly in rural parts of the country. So when it's about a margin everywhere, there's no reason to favor one point of the geography over another. And we can look within states that are battleground states where every vote's equal. Candidates do not favor the big cities at the objection of rural voters. Quite the opposite. If 12% of the state lives in rural parts of the state, 12% of the campaign goes there. It's actually quite scientific, and I'm happy to share that data with folks if they want. Overall, I would say, oh, Will, is this back to you or okay, sorry, I don't have my notes in front of me as I'm sharing the screen. Overall, I would say our opponents, our paid opponents of national popular vote, are quite right-wing. They are part of the mysterious Koch brother network. They also go around the country and oppose ranked choice voting, by the way, for those of you with some hometown pride over your excellent work there. And they have a problem attacking national popular vote and attacking the principles of every vote should be equal. When you get the most votes, you win. And they know full well that this policy is supported by 2 out of 3 voters, even in broad bipartisan terms. So they're left taking advantage of the fact that legislatures are busy. And if you serve in the Maine legislature, you're dealing with 100+ issues at any given day. And someone comes up to you and says, I want to talk to you about the electoral college. And you're saying, well, I'm dealing with a housing crisis and an overdose crisis and budget crisis and on and on and on. And so they take advantage of that. And they throw a bunch of silly arguments against the wall, but they sound true. And I'll give you just one example, and then we can get more into it if people want to. But that my favorite is they'll testify to this. They testify all over the country to this point. Well, this is all fine, they'll say, but do you know there's no such thing as a national popular vote total? So how can you hinge the Electoral College to national popular vote if there's no such thing as a national popular vote total? And they just ignore the fact that in federal statutes since the 1880s, there's been a requirement that every state publish and produce a popular vote total for the state. So there's a grain of truth, I guess. There's no bureaucrat in Washington who's responsible for recording the national popular vote. There's 50 bureaucrats plus one in DC that come up with the state total, and then any of us can do the math and come up with the exact same national popular vote total. And so they will try this kind of thing. They'll say, oh, well, this will not work with ranked choice voting. Or my favorite lately is, this is very divisive and there's no hurry. You better maybe just delay. And it's often just enough to poison us with a couple of legislators who haven't thought deeply about it and can make our work really challenging. But not so challenging that we won't prevail. Will, tell us about Augusta.
Sure. So I have been up in Augusta working on this a lot this session, with a lot of other great folks too. And we have a bill, that's advancing. So we are so excited about this. The bill that would implement the national popular vote in Maine is LD 1578. And it was voted out of committee a couple of weeks ago. It received a divided report, and it's going to move ahead to the full legislature. We had the public hearing at the beginning of January, which was really great. You know, there was over 150 pieces of testimony total. It was a really, it's a thing that a lot of people are really interested in. And the committee has, moved it forward. So we do expect the full legislature to take it up soon. As is always the case with the legislature, we can't say exactly when that will be yet, but the fact that the committee has taken their vote tells us that it will be pretty soon. And, I talk to legislators all the time about this, and, for some of them, they don't turn on to an issue really until it's been voted in committee. So that's just to say we are hitting the moment. This is the time to act. Legislators need to hear from you. If you have not contacted your legislator and urged them to support LD 1578, please, please, please do so. And I will just say, based on all the conversations I've had, that this matters whether you think your legislator is a rock solid supporter, whether you think they're undecided, or whether you think they're totally opposed, because legislators, one, they don't always hear from their constituents on issues, even on big issues. And so every piece of contact matters. Legislators talk to each other. They say, hey, I'm hearing a lot about this. I'm hearing from a lot of people who support this. And, they'll share that with their fellow legislators. So maybe a legislator who's supportive will tell a legislator who's on the fence, like, I think people really want this. And it makes a really big difference. There is nothing more effective than contacting your legislator and urging them to support this. So we have a few links in here that I see Kathleen will follow up with everyone to share. Thank you so much. And so we have a few different places where you can find a legislator contact tool if you want, sort of a guide that gives you some general things you can say that I always encourage you to personalize and put in your own voice. You can always also call your legislator, visit your legislator. But we have a few tools available to help get you started on that. And then I'll also just mention on our website at lwvme.org/mpv, we have a whole litany of tools available for you. Tools to help you with writing a letter to the editor. Those are really important. I hear people talking about, oh, this is what I saw in my local paper about this. I hear that all the time. That's a great way to make a difference. We do educational Zoom webinars. We're a little busy trying to get it passed right now, but we're always happy to do those. We love educating people on the national popular vote, why it's so important, doing things like this. So definitely get in touch with us about that. And then finally, I just want to share a couple resources if you want to dive deep on the national popular vote. I can't recommend the websites of both of our organizations enough. They have so much information. I know the national site, the nationalpopularvote.com, is really great for knowing kind of what's going on across the country around this. So I like to check in there and see what's going on there. There's a great book, Let the People Pick the President, that we've done in some book clubs in the league that I really recommend. We have an MPV specific mailing list on our website, so you can get some, more in-depth updates, and we have a Facebook page. So Chris, anything you want to add here?
Just how important it is for people to reach out. This polls very well. 2 out of 3 voters, even a strong majority of Republicans, once you eliminate the very far right. So it's not a partisan issue, but most people are not aware that states have this power. And so legislators sort of say, well, you keep telling me 2 out of 3 voters likes this, but I'm barely hearing from anybody. So it makes a huge difference. I would say more than anything, that is a very easy and effective way for people to help us. I'll just say a little piece of good news, and we'll turn it over to Maggie. We've seen great editorial support from the Portland Press Herald, right, Will? And terrific debunking of an op-ed from a retired poli-sci professor in the Bangor Daily News. Her headline was, "All of the complaints about national popular vote are silly," or something like that. I thought that was great. We could share those links, but we're seeing a lot of activity. We've been at this quite a while in Augusta, and we're feeling quite bullish that 2024 is our year. So we'd love to have your help.
And that brings us to the end of the presentation piece, but I would love for some questions for us to take on.
Absolutely. And thank you both. I confess, if my own emotional journey through this lunch and learn is any indication, Chris, you had me reliving the insurrection and feeling really anxious about the upcoming presidential election. And Will, you swept in and reminded me about the promise of one person, one vote, and all of a sudden I'm feeling a little bit better. So That alone, thank you. Um, Others had more substantive questions and reactions, so I want to get into those. But first, want to remind everybody that you will get an email from us later this afternoon with the link to this recording. Share it far and wide. You could even send it to your lawmaker and say, hey, I learned a lot from this. I bet you could too. And we'll also have all of those links, including an action alert that will make it really easy for you to send a message directly to your legislator. So look for that later this afternoon. And let's get into some questions. Just to be clear about how it works, it took a constitutional amendment to give residents of Washington, D.C. votes in the Electoral College, right? So do we need a constitutional amendment to include D.C. in a popular vote arrangement? Or I feel like you figured this out, so tell us how it works.
Sure, that's a great question. So no, we don't need a constitutional amendment for any piece of this. And in fact, all of the what somebody will tell me what the number was that gave DC 3 electors. They were given maybe the 23rd Amendment, but all that did was say, Washington, you get electors, just as if you were a small state. And then the City Council of Washington, D.C. had to pass the winner-take-all rule. So National Popular Vote went and lobbied them, and they passed National Popular Vote. They have, in fact, they're part of the agreement, and their 3 electors are part of our pool already. So just to reinforce that, they, in this case, act exactly like a state and have signed on to the National Popular Vote Compact. And of course, they're a very lopsided political state. So they in that sense, they are the bluest of the blue, and their vote is not courted and not something that candidates pay attention to.
Yeah, I can tell, Chris, you mentioned that you get a lot of the same questions wherever you go, and that definitely held true here. Thank you for tackling the won't this hurt small states and won't this favor big cities questions, but I think they're worth spending some time on, because we've all been coached to ask those questions, perhaps by forces not with our best interests in mind, but still. You said that this would push candidates to seek support in all 50 states, but aren't they still going to pick and choose? I mean, will this slant things? Will this be a different kind of flawed system, flawed in a different way?
Well, I mean, we're not a panacea, right? But there is some thing to the principle, and Will, I want to have your comments too, but every vote should be equal. You get the most votes, you should win. I mean, let's just start there. That this is an interruption of those principles. It is a real problem, and as we went through today, creating very real world problems for us. And so change is scary, right? And it's not just in a small rural state like Maine that our opponents will say, like, well, why would we do this? Why would we give our electors to be decided by New York and California? They're so big. That's the emotional appeal. But they say that in Michigan, which has 15 electors, in Minnesota with millions of people, right? So this is and it just feels true. New York and California have 18% of the country, and there's a lot of Republicans. Those are blue states. There's a lot of Republicans in both states. And so you don't control anything when you have 18% of the population. And we shouldn't just overlook the many millions of Republicans that come out of both of those states. And even if that were true, if they were universally Democrats in New York and California, well, then there's Texas and Florida. And if you add Ohio, you're pretty well balanced. And so this is what I mean, and this is why it excites me, that when you get rid of the state lines, in a sense, it becomes about margins everywhere. And you don't win and lose states. You try to drive up the score for your candidate and and drive down the score, I guess, for your opponent. And I'll take Vermont. We're tiny, right? We're half of Maine, 630,000 people. The candidates are not coming to Vermont for weeks on end. I concede that. But they right now, when they're polling, they remove Vermont. When they're doing a mailing, they remove Vermont. They remove at least the first CD in Maine. They remove about 80% of the country right now. That changes because we have mailboxes in Vermont, right? And we have TVs. And so they're in touch with us. They have telephones to poll us. So we're back on the table in that sense. But then this other dynamic, and this is to me the closing argument. Right now, under winner take all, and I'll just use Vermont, the Democrat always wins. And the Democrat doesn't care if they win by 9% or 17% because they get the same prize. And the Republican loses, and they don't care if they lose by 8% or 12% because they've lost the same prize. They just don't get 3 electors. That changes radically under national popular vote. The Democrats come here and they say, hey, Vermont, you've always been good to us. Can you get us 5,000 more votes? Because that'll really help me with the problems I'm getting in Alabama. And the Republicans will say, hey, now I do care. Let's try to stem the bleeding. And what that means is people like me, who I went door to door, I run in every office, in every election since 2006, every 2 years. I never talked about the presidential election in a meaningful way. I never tried to get more votes for the Democrat in my case. That changes. If you're a grassroots activist right now, you want to get involved in Vermont, you get car drive to New Hampshire. So you got a tiny portion of people who might engage. That changes. There's no reason to go to New Hampshire. You just go talk to your colleagues at work, or bring up that awkward conversation at the family dinner table, or talk to your neighbors. When it's about margins, it doesn't matter if you live in Manhattan or Burlington or in anywhere. Your vote is just the same everywhere, and so this idea that we have anything to fear here, I think is silly. And also we can look at loads of data around what it means to elect somebody statewide for governor or US Senate in all of the country. And you see there that rural people are not ignored, for instance. And in fact, the current system ignores rural states. It ignores agricultural states because they happen to be in mostly red states. And so we shouldn't also concede that there's any benefit to those populations now. There is not. They are deeply harmed by the current system.
I'll just very quickly chime in because Chris covered that so well, but I'll just chime in to add my own story from growing up. So I grew up in Virginia, and when I was young, Virginia was seen as a solidly red state, and so it was so sleepy. Nothing happens presidentially. I remember no campaigns basically happening in my childhood. And then when I hit the years where I was, becoming a senior in high school, all of that was 08, 2012. That's when Virginia was a swing state. And it felt really cool. We had the presidential candidates coming to town. I remember skipping school to go see one speak. It was so exciting, getting my civics hours working on a presidential campaign that mattered. And then you fast forward to 2020, where it was a double-digit margin on the other side. And Virginia doesn't matter again. My parents they love getting politically engaged, and they don't get to do anything for the presidential elections. So even if you have that swing state moment, it's fleeting. The country changes, and it shouldn't depend on that. It really shouldn't depend on that. You should have the opportunity to be engaged in every presidential election.
I love that. And I love that I hadn't thought about what this means for turnout, which is one of the things we think about, right? In helping people get engaged in our democracy, we say it's really important to go vote. Well, here's the proof, and here's the path. Another challenge that we often talk about, and I wonder if NVP can help with this, is, does it have anything to do with the two-party system? Do we feel like it might give us any path to seeing a truly viable third-party candidate?
I don't know that it does any more than we see that in governor's races. where every vote's equal, you get the most votes, you win. But it does protect against the sort of fluky nature right now of what it might mean to have a stronger independent or third-party candidate in Georgia when the whole country is dependent on Georgia, or in Florida in 2000, right? So in that way, it's a bit of a protection against the sort of fluky nature of what that can mean. But I come from an independent third-party background. I think to me that's got to start at the local grassroots level and build power. But I don't think the system is sort of better or worse necessarily. That's a different challenge.
That's fair. This doesn't have to solve every challenge we face. It's
you.
okay to tackle one really big one.
Yeah.
And so let's make sure we're all clear on exactly what happens here. Right now, say again, how many states have signed the National Popular Vote Compact?
17.
17. And for those 17 states, nothing has changed yet.
That's yes.
So we've got another set 8, I think, this year. Is that right? Considering
States considering, yes. Your parents, Will, in Virginia can help us out. Virginia is considering our bill, and a handful of other states, yes.
Okay. And so once we pass that, once the states that have signed on to National Popular Vote represent 270 or more electoral votes, what happens then?
Yeah, great question. It's not going to happen in time for November.
Okay,
So,
that was my next question. So
I don't think. I mean, I guess I am surprised a lot these days, but in a way, we're growing a pool, and when the pool is enough to elect the president, then it goes into effect, and nobody will care what states have joined the pool. You run a campaign, you add up the popular votes in all 50 states plus DC, and whoever gets the most votes will get this block of 270 or more from the pool, and they'll go to the White House. And in that way, I think of it this way. Right now, the Electoral College is a tiny little rubber stamp in every state. We're turning it into a big rubber stamp for the country. So when we reach that trigger, and the trigger is really important, it's why states can pass this without worrying, because it just sort of hovers there. When we pass 270, one of the governors of these states will say, I've noticed this is in effect, and they'll sort of fly the flag. And no doubt will be challenged in court, but this is really deeply rooted in an originalist argument, in a states' rights argument, and built on the current jurisprudence, which is absolute. States have plenary power, a total power over their own electors. And they've even in court rulings said there's just no limit to that. You could have in Vermont the 3 tallest people. If it was state law, our 3 tallest people will be electors. I don't know why you do that, but you could. In Massachusetts, they passed this bill and it became the 12th law on the books of how to award electors. There have been many attempts to say this system's not fair, and lawsuits, and the Supreme Court, by and large, doesn't take them because there's not a lot of questions here. So, so I think we're confident we'll survive any of those court challenges. We know that's going to come. And then the good thing is it won't take years to wind through courts, and interstate questions go directly to the Supreme Court. And so what happens is we hit the threshold. Governor says, hey, this is the law of the land. We spend some time in front of the Supreme Court, and then we run an election where people's eyes open up and go, hey, I'm a Democrat in Oklahoma and the Dakotas, and I'm a Republican in California and Seattle, and suddenly I sort of care. I think that will be very positive.
I just went on another little spiral thinking about this going before the Supreme Court, and with the current composition of the court. But then I'm thinking about there's an argument about some election deniers who think states should have ultimate power to choose any electors they want. So I'm wondering what you think about the odds, it feels like this, you might have just hacked the system and figured out how to use their election denying tendencies against. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm going to let
Yeah,
you
no, it's
talk.
okay.
I'm just spiraling.
Well, in 2020, largely this current court upheld, and you can find it on the nationalpopularvote.com website, affirmed the power of states to have faithless elector laws. In other words, to hold their electors to their feet, to their promise of, you're the Republican, you vote for the Republican. Um, and in that decision, it was a unanimous decision. There were great quotes that just go directly to our argument. Now, the current court, 5 out of 9 on the court were appointed by second place presidents, right? So there's another impact of the way we're doing it today. And so I hesitate to predict this court. We have a few years before we're going to be in front of them. I suggest, I would expect, but again, it is, the mental gymnastics that you would have to do after a lifetime of jurisprudence that says, no, this is exclusively up to the states, and the very straightforward reading of all the Constitution says, that Will highlighted earlier, each state shall appoint in a manner as the legislature thereof may direct. I mean, and the history of, winner take all is creating a lot of problems. Only 3 states used winner take all in the first presidential election, and they all went and repealed it. And for decades, states were trying all sorts of different things. The district system like you have, and in New Jersey, the governor appointed electors. There's a rich history. It's not always been static like we see currently. So predicting the court is a fool's errand, especially today. But the jurisprudence is and the sort of straightforward reading of the Constitution is all in one direction, and it favors what we're doing.
Thank you. I'm trying to think about which questions to ask, given that we just have a few more minutes and could talk about this all day. I think probably the most important question to ask is, if I reach out to my representative or my state senator and they say, this won't work, I don't think this is a good idea, what's the quick line, what's the 30-second elevator pitch that I should deliver in response?
Well, I'll let Chris add what he's learned as well, but I would say I always just go back to those 3 points I put on the first slide of, the benefits. And, you should say, I think every vote across the country for president should be equal. I believe that every vote matters. Every vote should be equal. I think that's kind of the principle. Like, I want my vote to count as much as everyone else's vote. That's what democracy looks like, really. That's kind of where I go first. But Chris, I don't know if there's any other lines that really work for people.
Yeah, I do think it's important to come to those basic principles, because it's very difficult to disagree that every vote should be. Why shouldn't my vote count just as much as anybody else? The other thing is to point, look, this is not a new idea. We first introduced this bill in 2007 in Augusta, and 0 states had passed it. Okay, at that time. And then Maryland, about a month later, with at the hand of now Congressman Jamie Raskin, constitutional law professor, enacted national popular vote. Maryland was the first state, 2007, and we had 10 electors. So there's now 17 states. So if your legislator is giving you a hard time about this, you might suggest that this has been well debated, endorsed by your biggest newspaper, by the League of Women Voters, which is a great moral authority, by you all in the climate movement, by loads of really smart, caring people. And then ask them to talk to Will, because he knows the answers, and or any of us. There's a team on the ground there. Beth with Conservation Voters doing a great job, doing a lot of help outreach. And the bottom line is we're really close to having the votes. We think we can pull this off. And then I guess I would just say 2 out of 3 voters likes this. This is not controversial. People are definitely hearing from opponents, and the opponents know they're a small group, and so they're noisy and angry. But they're a small group, and we shouldn't fall for that.
I love it. And you wrapped it up so perfectly. And I'm still going to ask one more question because I don't want to skip this one. What about the voters in states that have not passed MVP? When that flag goes up, the pool is big enough, we control it. Do the votes of people in states that didn't sign on to the compact get counted more, less? Like, how does that balance happen?
It's a great question. And I always pick on Oklahoma because they're such a deep red state. By the way, the Oklahoma Senate passed our bill and many years ago, before we were in a more partisan dynamic. Oklahoma is unlikely to sign on here. But all of a sudden, the voters of Oklahoma will go into that 51-line spreadsheet. And so Oklahoma will award, I think it has 9 electors. Looking at my map, it has 7 electors. They will award their 7 electors under winner take all like they do today. But the votes of Oklahomians and every other non-compacting state will go into the national total. And so suddenly campaigns will be active in all of those states courting votes because it will be looking for those margins. Remember that margin argument. And suddenly a Democrat in Oklahoma is just as valuable as a Democrat in Arizona is today, because they might be decisive. And so, you know, those states, I would guess we will quickly add a bunch more states because people will be like, hey, this is cool. This matters all of a sudden. And we'll get a little insulation instead of being at 273 or whatever.
It's hard to say goodbye when I have so many questions and this wonderful group has so many questions, but we are at the top of the hour. We are so grateful for the work that you are doing and for you taking the time to walk us through it today. It is really, really exciting. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Will. Thank you to everybody who's on the call today. We will send you a follow-up email including all of those resources and contact information if you have more questions we didn't get to, and also a link to send a message directly to your lawmakers. Let's get this done. We will be off next week. It's school vacation week, so hope you all have wonderful, exciting plans. We will see you, believe it or not, it will be March when we are back together again, and that is somehow only 2 weeks away. I don't know how, but we'll figure it out between now and then. And thank you again. Have a terrific weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.